Hi again then guys, and welcome to a special and different episode of the Beards and Cars podcast, and this one is actually intrinsically linked to my second channel, which for those of you who don't know is called HSG Unlimited. And I want to say straight off the bat that this video is it's entirely in fact based around spoilers for my newest short story. So if you're not subscribed to HSGU already, I would recommend at least clicking the link right below this video, going over there and listening to the story first. It's only about 14 minutes long, so it doesn't take that long to listen to, and then come back to this video if you would like to hear what the story means, some of my inspirations for it, some of the key points that I was putting through with the story, and maybe clearing up a couple of points that you might be wondering about after you've heard it and followed along. So I'll stop at this point in the video, give you about, 5 or so seconds to stop this video, maybe open another tab, listen to that one first. Like I said, slap that link down below. And of course, if you're coming over here from HSGU, welcome to the main channel. I hope you enjoyed the story. I hope that those of you who are going over to enjoy the story now do so. And now, of course, we can get into the meat of this behind the scenes video. So, A Room Called Sin. This is my third official story, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I wrote stories as a kid, but the three that I'm the most proud of are the two books that I've published on Amazon, which are called Buddy and Spore, and now this one. Now, this one, of course, is released exclusively on YouTube. The reason why I did that is because it's much shorter. I didn't think it was justified to be a paperback book, for instance, that I would charge money for. I'll still make, whatever from the monetization, not very much, but it's better than nothing, and I didn't really write this story to, make tons of cash. I wrote it because the idea came to me, and to get into the inspiration side of things first, the reasoning behind why I wanted to do a story like this has actually been a lifelong love for me, and that is that I love stories, horror, thriller, whatever it might be, even just a drama, for instance, which all takes place in one location. Such as 12 Angry Men, for instance, the classic movie. That's not a horror, it's kind of a thriller. I guess you could say it's a drama thriller. But this idea of an entire story, no matter how long or how short, taking place in one room. And that was the primary, underlying inspiration for A Room Called Sin. Now, as far as the name, you might have guessed, maybe if you allowed a few seconds or a few minutes to pass between listening to the story and then coming over to this video, to actually think about what you think the story means. Now, some of you, I think, might guess what the story implies, why, for instance, it starts and ends with the same sentence, and to put it simply and succinctly, the story is hell. That is the idea behind it. A Room Called Sin is hell. And basically my inspiration and my primary thought behind the story is I'm always thinking of ways to describe fear and horror and horrific events in my stories in ways that I haven't read before. I want to read things in a way that makes you think and makes you feel, rather than just, and blood splattered across the wall as Jason plunged his knife into the dumbass teen who can't run. I didn't want to be just another one of those. So in this story, I wanted to think, you know what, this concept of hell has been around for a long time. And there are even, in Buddhism, I don't recall the word, but when I was looking up what the name of this story was going to be, I came across a Buddhist word, which is referring to this endless recycling of life, which isn't necessarily a positive thing in this sense. And that got me to thinking, everyone imagines hell and the experience of a hell, especially religious people primarily, or the majority of religions, as this fiery torment. Now, on a slight side tangent, there's actually no basis for that in, for instance, the Bible whatsoever. The Bible has no reference to a specific hell beyond that just being the ground that you're buried in. That's it. Other references to a place like a lake of fire are not referred to as hell in the original Hebrew texts. So all of that is a fallacy as far as Christian religion. However, when it comes to this concept of hell, I think it is something that you can have a lot of fun with, as fun as hell can be. So I was thinking to myself, you know what, there's the obvious side, there's a big red devil with horns and a pitchfork and fire everywhere and people on roasting spits forever. Everyone's already imagined that. I wanted to imagine something new. Now, to clear up something in the story that you might have been wondering about, is Malcolm actually guilty? The answer is yes. He is a child killer, and that is why he's in the room. And a number of things in the story are actually entirely centered around that guilt, because another one of the things that I wanted to do with this book on a storytelling point of view is I wanted to actually make you as the reader, or as the listener in this case, perhaps feel a little bit uncomfortable, because through the majority of this story, you're probably wanting him to succeed. But he's a child killer. So I wanted that to kind of demonstrate how the power of storytelling can make you actually support someone who would under any other circumstances be the villain. And that is the real power of storytelling. Now, moving beyond that, there are a number of specific things that I did in this story that really tied into the concept of it being hell. Now, to get back briefly to what I was saying about reimagining hell, I was thinking that what could actually be more horrific than this idea of a never-ending cycle of reliving your guilt. Maybe the worst thing you ever did, the reason why you were in this hell situation to begin with. And this concept that, and you might have realized this listening to the story, but actually, he did confess his guilt, and he still died anyway. He had 2 strikes. Then he confessed, and he still died. At least, as dead as hell can be. That is very important to the story, because I wanted to highlight this kind of idea that in a realistic hell situation, the demons or whatever entities who live there, well, what better way of tormenting you could they give than hope? The best way of tormenting a prisoner is to give them hope of escape. Once they resign themselves to being a prisoner, they've essentially won. In this scenario, giving a sinner who has been bad enough to go to this place, the room called sin, giving them this idea that they can actually escape, for instance, making a door appear when it wasn't there before, that was very deliberate in the story. I wanted it to highlight this idea of ultimate torment, because, excuse me, because the ultimate torment is never physical. The ultimate torment is mental and emotional, and that is what the room called sin is all about. Now, originally, when I was writing the story, or conceptualizing it, I was imagining it as having maybe 2 or 3 different trials that he went through. The first one, sand, maybe the second one, water, the third one, fire, or perhaps bugs of some kind. But then, as I was writing it, I realized that A, the story didn't need to repeat itself in that kind of way, and B, sand was good enough, because in my stories, I like to appeal to certain aspects of horror that people naturally kind of cling on to, and one of those is, of course, being buried alive. There are kind of 3 things that tend to scare everyone. Being buried alive, burning, and drowning. They're essentially like 3 different versions of the same thing to some degree, which is a lack of oxygen, although with fire it's much more intense, of course, because you burn as well. But this idea in the story of being buried alive, but then add on another layer of that where every time you die, it's just going to start again. Now, I left a couple of things ambiguous in the story. For instance, whether or not Malcolm knows that he's coming back. And of course, at the start of the story, he doesn't. But the way that I envision it, and you could choose to disagree on this, for instance, if you want to feel a different way, because that's fine. I like to leave my books open to a personal interpretation to some degree, where the first time he wakes up in this room at the start of the story, that is actually the first time he's been there. So you essentially watched level 1 for him. Now, from this point onward, it's going to be this never-ending loop of the same thing. And imagine the layering effect of torment that would happen to that character each time he comes back, remembering the previous one. And maybe, in a sense of what I said about different trials, maybe each time he comes back to the room, the scenario is different. Maybe instead of sand, it is water. Maybe it's bugs. Maybe it's fire. Maybe it's, whatever else. That is the concept that I wanted to play with. This idea of a small white cube of a room, which you can never escape from and just be tormented in forever. Also kind of playing on the idea of what humans do to animals in, testing and stuff like that. They're stuck in this cage for their whole life, and we consider them to be lower life forms, and that makes it okay. So that kind of plays into it as well, with that sort of almost body horror aspect, although it's not explicitly shown. Another one of the things that I wanted to touch on in the story is kind of hinting that this has happened or could happen again. And again, you could view this as a contradiction. What I said earlier, for instance, about this being the first time he's been in the room. Yet, toward the start of the book, he's picking at his fingernail and there's a grain of sand underneath it. Again, that's open to interpretation. You could say, well, does that mean he has been in the room before and just doesn't remember? Or does that mean that the way he killed himself, which put him in this room in the first place, did it involve sand? Maybe he drowned on a beach, for instance. Maybe he jumped into the sea. I'd like to leave that open to your interpretation as well. Because, of course, part of the idea of an ultimate hell is that everything is a lie. And throughout the story, a number of things show that. For instance, when he first gets to the room, the wall has no feeling. There's nothing to it. It's just like clear plastic, except it's white plastic. There's no touch, there's no texture, no temperature. And then as he kind of develops through the room, it gets more detail over time. The table and chair appear. The speaker appears, and ultimately the door, that last-ditch hope for escape, appears. I wanted that to very directly lead into this concept of an evolving room that changes to torment you more and more, rather than just a fiery pit of hell. Now, another thing that I want to touch on, there's actually three primary things to do with the specific storytelling. The first one is that some people might be wondering, with regard to plugging up the holes, why didn't he, for instance, take off a sock and stuff that in the hole? Why didn't he just completely take off his shirt and put that in the hole? Why didn't he get a bunch of papers from the file and stuff that in the hole, or the leg of the chair? He seemed to give up too easily. Well, the reason why I wanted to actually have that in there, where he did try and then kind of gave up, it's actually twofold. There are two layers to why I did that. The one is that throughout this entire story, and if you listen to it a second time, I think you'll notice this a lot more. One thing that I wanted was to do with his character, and the second is practical. The first reason is he's a coward. This entire story is based around him being a coward. Throughout the entire thing, he never reads the file, and he doesn't do it because he can't face his guilt. It's very simple, and I'm sure many of you could guess that. But also, he's constantly looking to escape rather than face what he's there for, constantly asking the same questions like, why am I here, even though he's already been told, being in denial right up until the last second. For instance, and this is another one of the points that I wanted to touch on, this tear that rolled down his face after he admitted his guilt. You could see that in two ways. You could say, well, he finally repented. He finally atoned for what he did. Why was he still killed? Well, who was that tear for? Was it for Kathy? Or was it for himself? I would argue the latter. Now, the other thing that I was talking about was, why didn't he use more logic? Stuffing the clothes in the hole, that kind of thing. Well, again, that part ties into it. He's a coward. He's not a problem solver. He runs away from things rather than accepting guilt. But more importantly than that, on a practical level, because of course somebody's survival will typically override that, the logic of a dream comes into play. When you're in a dream, you have some logic. You can generally talk to other people in your dream. You can move around. But your logic has limits. Often you can't read things properly, or, things appear as strange in a dream. That is something which I wanted to factor in. This idea that hell could be like a dream, that you can never escape from it, an unending loop of torment and reliving guilt over and over again forever. And that was hugely important to the story, because to hinge on this idea of what ultimate torment would be, I actually started thinking down the lines of suicide. Somebody turns to suicide, as taboo as it is often to discuss, to escape the horror of life, for whatever reason. The idea that I wanted to play on in this story is, what if death couldn't save you either? What if you can't die? Your life is hell, but then so is death, so there's no escape from it. Living and dying, you're still in this never-ending loop. That, to me, really plays into this idea of unending true torment, mental torture that would ultimately drive you insane, but even insane, you still couldn't escape. And that tied into the logic of a dream, meant that, yes, he tried to plug up the holes, but he kind of gave up. He couldn't think of a better idea. But also I wanted to have his clothes tie into this idea of the room changing. Because if you notice in the story, he at first tears off some cloth and stuffs it in the hole. But then when he tries to do it again, the cloth won't break. Why? Because the parameters have changed. The room gave him hope and then took it away. That is something that was crucial to the entire framework, the mechanicals of the story, if you will, as far as how the physics work in this room. Because it appears to be relatively normal, but it is in fact changing all the time. It's like a Rubik's Cube of a room. Now, the final thing that I wanted to touch on in this behind-the-scenes look at the story and, the inspirations and that kind of thing was the ultimate arc of the story, because the character doesn't have an arc. He starts as a coward, and he ends as one, and that's the point. That's why he's in the room to begin with. But the concept behind the story is refusal to accept guilt, because guilt is something which has actually been a fantastic catalyst to some of my favourite movies. One that always comes to mind is The Machinist, with Christian Bale. My favourite performance of his, probably my favourite movie of his, in fact, even more than Ford v Ferrari, even more than The Prestige, Batman. It's just such a fantastic film. It's the kind of thing that I would have loved to have been involved in somehow. And I don't want to spoil it, but saying that guilt is involved is about as far as I'll go. And it's a perfect example of that kind of film. There have been a number of fantastic films involving guilt. Frailty is another one, for instance, which I would strongly recommend checking out. It's got Matthew McConaughey in it. Now, that was the kind of thinking that I had this video all combined behind this story. Now, some of my stories and some of my books are inspired by movies. And for those of you who might be wondering if I'm going to give any writing tips or story tips for those of you who would like to be writers, I do have a couple, and it tends to be things that I say every time. One thing is try to be as unique as you can. Don't copy other people. Don't do your version of a story. You contribute things, but there's a very fine line there. For instance, my second book tributes or pays homage even to Splinter, the 2008 horror movie. But at the same time, if you read my book and then watch Splinter, they're actually very different. So paying homage to something and mimicking something are two very different things. And unfortunately, YouTube tends to be one of the worst places for that. People just rip other people off and copy them all the time. Now, as far as my advice for budding writers or people who would like to be, the number one thing, well, I guess number two thing, because I've already said number one, would be to structure your story before you begin. And this is something which has been, and I cannot stress this enough, massively important to me. Back in the day, I started so many stories that I never finished. And the reason why was simple. I knew what I wanted the start to be, and usually I knew what I wanted the ending to be. It was always that middle portion where I'd get stuck. So I found that in order for me to actually complete a story and to be happy with it, such as I have with these three, A Room Called Sin, Buddy, and Spore, I had to map out essentially everything that was going to happen in kind of a skeleton of a story, if you will, like notes on paper, which is something that people do for a movie script as well. And this allows me to kind of fill in the little gaps between the primary story points, but then know exactly where I want the story to go ahead of time. And there are two other stories at least that I haven't started writing yet that I haven't completed this process on. And until I do, I won't start writing them, because if I do start, I know I won't finish. So that might not apply to everyone, but it is a hugely beneficial piece of advice for me that I will give you anyway to see if it does benefit you. The third and final thing, and this is a very personal one as well, this might not help other people, but it's actually very important to me. Because I'm such a movie fan, and I always have been, especially horror, I envision all of my stories and all of my books as movies first. Because to me, if something could play out on a screen and be something that you can enjoy and be invested in and affect you, then it can work on paper as well. Whereas sometimes, I would argue, the other way round doesn't always work. There are certain books which don't translate all that well to the screen, but I think that lots of screen-based movies can translate to a book very well, perhaps even more so than the other way around. So for instance, Buddy, the first book I wrote, I imagine that as a movie first. I imagine the actors, the locations. I knew exactly how it looked in my mind every step of the way. And when I read Buddy, I see that in my mind, and to me that is massively important. Likewise with Spore. I know where I'd shoot the film, I know the car, I know the characters, I know how everything would look. Likewise with this one. And of course, this one's fairly easy to imagine because it's just one guy in a room. But if, for those of you who would like to know what does this Malcolm character look like, I actually imagine Malcolm in this story as looking or being even played by Adam Driver, who played Kylo Ren in Star Wars. He is the actor I imagine when I think of this character in the story. His kind of height, his, longish hair, kind of semi-unkempt beard, almost like he's already a prisoner. That is the guy who I imagine in this story. So, of course, with all three of my stories, I would love to have an opportunity to make him into like a short film or even a movie. Probably this one more so a short film because I wouldn't want to stretch the source material. And I guess that actually brings me to the final point that I have. The final piece of advice that I have for potential writers, and this is something which I always try to do, is don't use filler. There's a reason why Buddy and Spore are novellas, not novels. There's a reason why this one is a short story, not an hour long. It doesn't need to be. Don't write a story to try and make it be a certain amount of pages. Write a story in the way it should be told. If it requires more pages, it naturally will. But don't try to make a book that will impress people. Don't try to make, the next Stephen King's It, like 7,000 pages long, like a Bible-sized book. Because if you do, chances are you'll fail. Take as long as the story needs. And sometimes, such as in the case of A Room Called Sin, take as little time as a story needs. I would argue that the point and the feelings and the emotions and the lesson, if you want to think of it that way, that I wanted to put across with this story didn't really need any longer than 15 minutes. That's exactly how long I made it. So, for those of you who went over to the other video and watched it and came back, I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, if you haven't read my other stories, I would recommend, of course, doing so. I wouldn't have published them if I wasn't proud of them. They are both longer than this one, about 4 times longer. Each of the books takes about an hour or so to read. And for those of you who don't know what my books are about, and if you'd like to maybe sample them, there's also a link down below to my Amazon author page. You don't have to buy the books to be able to read them. You can actually read the first couple of pages for free to get like a feeling for it. But for those who are not familiar with them, Buddy, my first book, is a coming-of-age psychological horror about a young boy who is getting bullied, who runs into this guy who he's never met before, just a random guy on the way home from school. And this guy offers to help Lucas, the boy, with his bullies. But he ends up helping him in some unusually violent ways. So think of something like, Stand By Me, but then meets like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, that kind of combination. My second book, Spore, that is much more straightforward. Buddy is a very thinking book. If you read it a second time, it has a very different impact on you. There's a lot of things that you might have missed the first time. In the second one, Spore's just about fun. Like I said, it's my tribute to Splinter or John Carpenter's The Thing, which is my favourite movie, and it's a straight-up creature feature. It's about a young girl in her late teens who's attending a countryside rave in the UK in an abandoned barn. The police show up to break up the rave. Everyone scatters into the woods. She runs straight into a tree and knocks herself out in the dark. Wakes up in the back of the police car who's taken her home, and then the police car hits something. And from then on, it's once again, one location-based survival horror. How would you defend yourself within a car that won't move against a creature that's trying to get in and kill you? That's the idea of Spore. So I would recommend the second one to somebody who maybe doesn't want to think too much, they just want some fun, fast-paced monster story. If you want to think more and, reread a story and get more out of it, then I'd recommend Buddy. And I would say, if you enjoyed this story, A Room Called Sin, then I think you'll probably enjoy Buddy. Because they're fairly similar in terms of the thought behind them. Whereas Spore's much more of a popcorn story. So you'll definitely enjoy it, but it's just not the same kind of thing. So ultimately, I hope you enjoyed the story. Give me your thoughts down below, maybe some of your theories about the story. Tell me what you think. And also maybe some things that I'd mentioned that maybe you hadn't realised, such as it being a never-ending loop or based in hell, that kind of stuff. So of course, stick around on the channel for the occasional content like this, and if you do want more of my short stories, and even some of my stories which some people don't think are stories, such as my unsolved mysteries, then check out the second channel for those. I put one out not that long ago about the diary of an asylum patient, and if you enjoyed this story, you'll definitely like that one. And even on this channel, the most successful video I've ever done, the only video I've done to have over 1 million views, is also one of my stories. So check that one out, check out the others. I think you'll enjoy them as well, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.